So welcome all to this, the next in a series of podcasts with frontline practitioners and sector experts. I'm going to hand over to the panel and they will introduce themselves. So first of all, start with Will.
Thank you very much. So I'm Will Jordan. I'm a co-founder at IMP Software, and we look after lots of multi-academy trusts up and down the country, looking at their budget planning, in-year reforecast and financial reporting.
Thank you.
I'm Adrienne Lane. I'm the Operations Director of the Challenge Academy Trust, which is a multi-academy trust with 10 academies from age 3 to 19 in Warrington.
Thank you.
And I'm Simon Oxenham. I'm the Director of Resources for Southend High School for Boys, and I'm also the Interim Chief Financial Officer for Southend East Community Academy Trust, which is a multi-academy trust of 7 schools.
Thank you very much, Simon. Okay, so today we're going to cover 2 broad areas. One is the subject of financial governance during this period of the pandemic, and the second thing we're going to try and cover is some of the planning that started related to the recovery phase and the reopening of schools. So if we could just start with each of your interpretation of what financial governance looks like during this new normal, and in particular how you've interpreted the recent guidance that's been released around some of the relaxations. So we start with Will.
Okay. Right. So I think in broader terms of the recent relaxations, I've seen, certainly with our client base and from trusts that we speak to quite frequently, that it's not going to have a big impact into the normal financial operations of the trusts. I think it's welcome that the return is not required to be produced for submission elsewhere, so that's definitely a saving. But actually the need for financial governance and the need to be even hotter on what you would normally be doing is probably more pronounced now than perhaps it's ever been during most of our clients' careers.
Yeah, I think that's right. So Adrienne, I don't know how you reacted to the letter that was issued last week by the Chief Executive of the ESFA, and whether how you interpreted those.
Yeah, I think in the first instance there was a bit of a relief that you were saved the time and effort of putting in your own data into the various websites and forms and records and reports that you have to do, because just the very act of turning your own data into DFE required data is a considerable time resource on trusts, and that's not something we have at the moment, any of us. I think I agree with Will in that actually it hasn't made any difference, practically speaking, in the processes and the schedule that we have to go through to produce our budgets, to produce monthly reports for monitoring internally. I think those internal processes are ongoing and they are staying the same. I think it's the relief of not having to translate them into DFE speak, as it were, that actually is a big saving in terms of time. I also think, though, that there might well be from this be a bit of a reassessment to see actually what does the DFE actually need in terms of its requirements going forward, because there were a huge list there of various reports and processes that weren't going to be required or have been paused. And some, I look at it and some from the assurance point of view, you will need to do. So as a multi-academy trust, we have SCA, we have to do the return every year, and that's been paused. But I cannot see from a financial governance and assurance point of view from the government why that would not be wanted later. I'm absolutely certain we will have to do that report, because they'll need to know that we're spending their money in the purposes for which it was intended. But some of the others, will you do a May BFRO in future? I don't know, because if you're going to do one in July, why are we doing it in May? But that's always been a question that practitioners have sometimes asked. But I think fundamentally, I agree with Will. actually it hasn't made any difference to the internal processes of every school. We still have to go through that for our own assurance and our own planning purposes.
Thank you, Adrienne. And Simon, I know that we've had conversations over the last few weeks about BFRO and the BFR, and maybe you want to elaborate on the slight frustrations that you have about the if you like, the unknown around the BFR. So is it going to happen? Isn't it going to happen? There's a point at which it makes no difference if they cancel it because all the work's been done. So Simon, maybe you can elaborate on that slightly.
Yes. So in my role as national lead, we've been having conversations with officials and with yourself about what may or may not be required and when it might be required. And we pressed very hard to try and get them to look beyond just the BFRO, to look at all the other returns and also the requirements as far as complying with the handbook and things like, do you still need to have your 6 trustee meetings? Do you still need to keep your internal scrutiny visits going on and stuff like that? So there's been a whole raft of things like that which we looked at. But with the BFRO, yes, it's great that they've cancelled it. And as far as actually getting the data, they had, of course, the March actuals from last year in the BFR, and they can stitch that together, although it's not a perfect match, with our period 12 data from the AAR, although the headings are not absolutely perfect. So that solves that problem for them. But the thing that we were pressing for, which we didn't get, was the an early indication of what's happening with the BFR. Because if you remember with the BFR, you still need essentially the second half of the BFRO data, which is your position, actual position as at March this year, plus your position, your predicted outturn, your forecast position for the 31st of August for this year. And then, of course, you've then got the budget for next year splits, 7 months and 5 months, and then the 2 following years. So in actual fact, if you look at the process that we have to go through now, typically around about now, you've got trustee meetings where they're looking at draft budgets and forecasts for 2 or 3 years down the road at this point in order to have an involvement and help shape the budget. Then in May, you would typically have done the BFRO. In June, you'd then be meeting again to get the BFR recommended by your finance committee or resources committee, whatever it's called, in order for the full trust board to approve it in July, to submit it in as the BFR later in July. So not having a decision to either go ahead or cancel at this point is not terribly helpful. Deferring it doesn't really work, because by June it will be too late. We'll have all had to have done the work on the basis that A, we need a budget for next year anyway, but also we think that the return probably is going to be required. So that's where we got to with that one.
So two questions on that. One is, I guess the first one is, what is the latest that you could meaningfully benefit from a postponement of that return? And the second question is, what assurance risks do you believe are associated with not having that information? So if I start again with Will on that one.
I mean, I'm kind of not fussed about whether they cancel the BFR or not, and that might be easy for me sitting here outside of the context of working in an academy trust. But regardless of whether you have to fill out that form at the end of July or not, you're still going to be looking at your 3-year budget plan anyway. And all right, the assumptions are always based on what you think might happen, and I think those assumptions are going to be perhaps a bit broader and more unknown than they would normally. But I'm not convinced that a cancelling of the, I mean, a deferral, I mean, who knows what's going to happen at the end of July? Who knows where we're going to be in this whole process? But I'm not as concerned, and I don't feel from our customers that they're really focused on that, because they're already deep into budgets now. You know, many of which have got to first level approval at the moment, kind of local budgets, and that first iteration of budgets approved, and they're going through their cycle regardless of what happens with the BFR. What's the second question, Stephen? Sorry.
So the second question was really around the assurance risk attached to postponing or even cancelling that return.
I think on the assurance side, I think actually that Dear Accounting Officer letter was quite helpful, because it was taking quite a pragmatic view that, look, the financial handbook is still there, and there's these rules and these regulations and there's these checks and balances that you all need to do. But there was a really pragmatic realization that, you know, the world changed overnight back in March, and you cannot do things like get signatures on piece of paper. You cannot meet in person. So I think that letter's been really helpful, and therefore assurance risk wise, I think in terms of risk generally, that's massively more important. In terms of assurance around that, again, I think assurance needs to stay at a similar level, if not heightened, to react to the risk. And I don't necessarily see that the lack or deferral of a BFR perhaps impacts that risk or process too much in the interim.
Okay, no, that's helpful, Will. And Adrienne, just on the point of budget forecasts, and particularly the 3-year forecast, is, you know, inevitably there's already conversations about, you know, we know so little about what's going to happen in the next week. How on earth are we going to plan for the next year and the next 3 years? But presumably before COVID hit, people were already starting to think about their 3-year plans based on a degree of certainty around funding. I just wondered what's your take on that?
Well, I think you're right. I think the vast majority of trusts will have been doing a 3-year forecast, looking at their budget. Certainly all our schools are looking at their budgets, looking at the 3 years, putting the basis together, going through, as Will said, first level approval. Ours will be going to our trust board in June, ready for approval, and that's not going to change. I think what has changed is the level of range of assumptions and what will go into the commentary around, particularly around year 2 and year 3. I've always had a view that year 3 of a trust, a school, an academy budget is unreliable in the extreme. Even year 3 is. Year 2 is okay, but even in year 3 in our day and age, yes, it is useful to do it as a benchmark, but anybody who regards that as a basis on which to, say, do restructures or change fundamentally what they do really needs to gather more information first. And that's always been my view, because I think just the way we work, and even in the days when, you know, we had 3-year potentially fixed budgets, even then the other circumstances, expenditure, pay, all those things would change so quickly year on year that, you know, it was very hard in year 1 to make a good year 3 forecast. So I think what will change is some of the assumptions around it, and some maybe people will be advisable to put in a level of contingency for future costs. I mean, we don't know how long we're going to be in this situation for. We don't know what the next new normal is going to look like in terms of schools managing whether online learning, managing a hybrid version of in-school stroke online learning, how long that will last for, and all of that will have associated costs. So I don't see what people can do other than to plan on what they know, but put some very heavy contingency or explanation and assumptions around it for year 2 and year 3. Even year 1, you know, year 1 will be different.
I don't know what other colleagues on the call think, but I've always seen 3-year budgeting as an iterative process anyway. So, you know, I don't think that you should be held to task too firmly on your year 3 assumptions that you built 3 years ago. You know, once you get there, so things will move, but it is a finger in the air, if you like, in terms of where you might end up in 3 years. And I think, you know, an environment which is very, very fluid as things are at the moment, I think it's reasonable to be revisiting those assumptions on a fairly regular basis. I'm just going to turn to so thank you, Adrienne. I'm just going to turn to Simon for a moment. Eileen Milner, in her letter, Dear Accounting Officer, did offer some concessions in terms of what was expected of multi-academy trusts, single academy trusts, but also I think made quite clear, or my interpretation was made quite clear, that the expectation to ensure robust financial governance was not in any way compromised, and so the expectation for things to continue as they had been and controls to be in place as they were historically, there's no let up on that. I just wondered whether you got a similar sense from that letter, or whether you picked something else up from it.
Yeah, I think my initial reaction when I glanced at it was make it up as you go along, but don't stray too far from the handbook. But then, having looked at it retrospectively, I've kind of moved on to, well, actually what she's really saying is you need to abide by the handbook, but you need to think about changing your processes, taking internal scrutiny. There's still that requirement, and they're suggesting that actually now you need to update your scheme of delegation and possibly have the internal scrutiny looking at how you're operating remotely versus being in the office. So that's kind of where I ended up with it. Do I think the BFR's going to go ahead? I think it probably will. Is it critical? I think it's more important that trusts have budgets approved ready for next year, because that's part of charity law, and that's not within the gift of the DfE to change at this point in time.
So just picking up on that earlier point, Simon. So you've obviously had a look at the letter, and you've gone back, you've revisited, you've changed slightly your thinking, having read it the second time. Clearly, you're a very confident, very capable practitioner, and you can kind of read between the lines and make a judgment. But do you think that's going to create some problems for those that are less confident? So when, for example, it talks about a physical internal audit being very unlikely, but you might want to reflect as a board and as an audit committee on what's appropriate. For those that are more agile and more kind of fleet of foot, that won't be a problem. But for those who are perhaps a little bit, rabbits in the headlights, slightly nervous about not being told exactly what to do you think that might present a problem?
Yes, I think it could, but I think, again, you need to have an element of pragmatism about this, and I think I'd have a conversation with your internal audit function, service, or responsible officer, or whatever you're doing, and see what their views are. At the moment, the information and guidance is coming out of pace. So I signed up, because I'm quite a sad individual, to alerts from the DfE. So anytime they publish anything on their website, I get an alert. Since the 25th of February, up until the point that we're doing this recording, I've had 163 alerts in relation to COVID-19. That's an awful lot of information to kind of assimilate and digest and think, okay, so what's the practical application of this? So all the responsible officers, internal auditors, they're all going to be trying to digest this and think, okay, so now what should we be doing, and what should we be advising our clients at this point? So my advice would be, have a conversation and see what you can do pragmatically, because what you don't want to end up doing is getting to having your accounts audited in end of October, beginning of November, whenever, and then you start getting audit findings where you haven't complied with the handbook and had the required number of internal audit visits. So that's why I say take a pragmatic view, have a conversation with them, and see what can actually be done between now and the end of the term.
Yeah, it's helpful, very helpful. So I'm just going to try and segue between financial governance and the reopening recovery phase, and I'll start with trying to explore how we start to build our financial plans, our financial models in response to COVID. And I think Adrienne already alluded to the fact that there are going to be new unforeseen costs and measures that we need to implement, which inevitably will have a price tag attached to them. So I'm interested to explore a little bit about, in that 3-year planning, or even forget the 3-year, let's just take the next year and a half that's in front of us. do you think that schools and trusts should be thinking about the cost implications of reconfiguring schools, remote learning, a hybrid system of remote and face-to-face, possibly mitigating, developing mitigations for loss of income, and so forth? So how should that conversation be playing out? And again, I'll start with Will.
Well, I think before that conversation, I think there is a real. I think historically there's been a fairly steady cycle where budgeting and forecasting happens at certain parts of the year, and in many cases still, the budget's done. It goes into your finance system and it sits on the shelf until you come to look at your BFRO. And I think because of the uncertainty and because of how fast things are changing, and I think will continue to change for the coming months, I think one thing that is important is if you've got a clunky process and you don't have the ability to be agile in this ongoing iterative budget / forecast that's as out of date as soon as you produce it, it doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. It means that you've really got to focus on, right, this is going to be a constant thing that's going to be happening an awful lot over the next 6, 12, 18 months, who knows. So I think firstly it's making sure you're you have the ability to be more agile than perhaps you would have been in the past, because other than big things at annual time, obviously things do crop up. But then secondly, on the technology side, or whether we really need to be planning big what if scenarios, I think it would be worth considering big items like you discuss around reconfiguring premises around technology, but not in any detail. So this is purely to a point of, we've thought about these areas, and at the moment that's all that's warranted because there's not much clarity around, but just to steal a bit of a march for as and when and if some of these things do happen, it would be prudent to have had a conversation at least, but I don't think it yet warrants actually moving that any further forward into any kind of detailed planning.
Helpful. Adrienne, I mean, clearly you're right at the sharp end of this, so your perspective on this would be really interesting.
Yeah, I think the first, I differ slightly from Will, not 100%, but I think the first thing before you can get into the financial impacts and looking at modelling for your budget is actually to think about what the operations are going to look like. Now that's really hard because, as Will said, we have no guidance really. We have a lot of guesswork. We can plan, we can look at other countries. We're starting to be able to look at Germany. There's some information coming out of their very, very early stages of their returns and how they're managing that to education. But it's those sorts of elements I think we need to think about what education is going to look like when we return, because that's going to have a massive difference to whatever kind of financial provision we have to put into our budgets and what the sorts of things we have to do. So for me, the next sort of month or so, a few weeks, are going to be critical in that process. I'm hoping that there'll be guidance that will come out at some point from the government, which will give us some idea as to how we are supposed to be interpreting social distancing if schools do return, because that, by its very factor, is going to have a massive difference on how we use our schools. And I think a lot of schools are now looking at it, and certainly we are, and looking at various scenarios. So scenario 1 is partial return of a year group, or scenario 2 could be, for example, split days, those sorts of elements. So people are looking at those certain things and they're thinking what would suit their environment. And we have to get those sorts of ideas around the table first, because that is going to determine what we need. And playing next to that is the fact that my own interpretation of the situation is that we are going to have for some time some split line between online learning and learning in schools. That seems to me the way the government is hinting and moving forward, and how other schools, how other countries are moving forward as well. Now that means looking at our technology as well. And one of the things that we've learned from the last 2 months really, is that if you're looking at it, everybody else will be looking at it, and then it becomes a supply problem. The supply and demand in the delivery, the logistics of the country has become I'm sure it'll be an economics case in the years come by in universities of how people react. So it's those sorts of elements which you think you need to identify and put some ideas around, and that will impact on your financial modelling. I'm not sure you can do one without the other at the moment.
No, that's helpful. Simon, how do you see the interaction between pedagogical leaders and school business leaders playing out in this whole debate? And Adrian's quite rightly suggested that we need to have a clear sense of what it is we're trying to deliver before we start to cost it. But presumably, what we want to avoid is siloed conversations that pedagogical leaders are having in isolation. School business leaders are looking at the bottom line. They're not connecting. All the conversations are happening after the effect, and clearly we've got to add to that the role of trustees and governors. So, how do you see that playing out?
I believe the conversation about the need to close schools took place between the Secretary of State and 2 union leaders. I would suggest that the conversation about reopening schools needs to happen with probably more union leaders, but also with the Institute, because the actual impact is going to be felt more, I think, by the school business leadership cohort than it is by the pedagogical leaders, because the pedagogical leaders are thinking about pupil outcomes, about how to deliver lessons. But when you actually look at the practicalities, not everybody's got their sights mapped against the latest building bulletin guidance, so they don't actually know how big the rooms are. So you need to establish how big your rooms are, what the social distancing requirements are. You need to know how wide your corridors are. A lot of the corridors in my own school are not 2 meters. So you then got to have a one-way system. You've got to have somehow of policing that. How on earth do you police lunchtime and letting the kids on the playground? This is not going to be easy. So I think there's going to be a lot of challenges for the sector in their predicted outturn for this year, because there's so many factors at play where you're potentially going to lose private income, but could potentially put staff on furlough that are funded by private income. You've got loss of income from fundraising, from catering, from events, from lettings. You've got the additional costs potentially of remote home working, depending upon how far down you'd gone that road prior to COVID-19 coming. You've got additional premises costs of potentially having them open during Easter. Plus, we've had things like we've been told by the DfE that they'd like us to get all of our water systems chlorinated prior to reopening, which that is a piece of good news, because they're suggesting that needs to happen a week before we actually bring the pupils back in. Now, it's about 27,000 school sites in the country, and you normally get them chlorinated once a year. There ain't that many suppliers, which means that surely they've got to give us a long lead-in time to organise it. Plus, there's other factors. You've got all the trips that you've been cancelled. Hopefully, you've been able to get the cancellation costs covered. So there's all these things that are going to feed into your predicted outturn for this year. You've got to work through. I mean, thinking about the opening up, at the moment, DBS checks seems to be a problem. I've had a couple out for 2 months now, and they could be out while looking at it for another couple of months. So recruitment and actually getting staff back into school could be a problem. I don't know what others' experience is, but at one of the schools that I look after, I've got, it's a primary school, and I've got 23 staff who are actually shielding, including the head teacher. So how do I bring that one back online? So there's lots and lots of issues, but going to look at the European model and how they're starting to open up, it doesn't really apply to the UK. And the reason for that is we actually have the smallest classrooms with the highest number of pupils. So therefore we have a much higher density to deal with than they do. So you can't really look at Denmark and Norway and Germany, because our scenario is somewhat different. So I'm with you in as much as I don't think we're going to have the full cohort back into school anytime soon. I think it could happen in some weeks down the road, and probably on a rota basis. But just in that you think about the problems that brings, because you've got pupils that are travelling, and if you've got transport that you're providing to bring them in, then you can't really do part days, because that's going to kind of double your transport costs. And of course, if other schools have also got using the same transport providers, it gets even more complicated. So yeah, there you go.
So I mean, there's a huge logistical challenge. Will, just with your governor trustee hat on, if I might indulge you on this, how do you, what's your sense of the way that those conversations are either taking place or should take place?
I think it's a really difficult one, because I think, trustees are actually in a really difficult position, because, as a trustee, kind of the potential for risk is sky high, yet there's never a time where you've needed to support your executive team any higher. So I think it's a really challenging place to be as a trustee, where you've got legal responsibilities to safeguard and all of those things. Those legal responsibilities don't go away, but trying to have those conversations around how you might get some comfort around governance areas when actually people are focused on feeding families that are in need. It's really difficult, and I'm hopeful that the panic and kind of that reactive spirit as kind of moving away now it's a few weeks down the line, and I think where we have seen trusts that are working with their trustees are starting to perhaps be a bit more on the challenge side than the supportive, just because I think the situation has perhaps moved on a bit. So really difficult over the past few months, but I do think we're in a position, obviously we've got another challenge on the horizon with reopening schools that's going to bring everything back to kind of where we were back at the end of March. I think we're probably in a bit of a honeymoon period at the moment, where and that's very much relative honeymoon period in terms of the last few weeks and the few weeks ahead, and it could be a time, right now. I mean, who knows when the peak is?
And again, just sort of taking your trustee position, there's going to be I imagine an inadvertent kind of land grab, if you like, and that's probably a clumsy way of describing it. But when decisions are being made about the reopening of schools, they're going to be individual school business leaders in particular who are quite well versed in things like business continuity, risk management, all of the health and safety considerations, and they're going to be pedagogical leaders who are used to taking a lead in terms of how schools are organised, and so there's going to be the colliding of these two worlds at a point when we least need it. So I just wondered, from a trustee point of view, and I'm certainly grappling with this as a trustee myself, how will I manage those perspectives, both important, but both quite different in terms of where they're grounded and what their reference points are? Does that make sense?
I do, and I think that's where strength of guidance is really key, because it's impossible decisions, and I have huge sympathies for ESFA, Department for Education, and the politicians, but without that guidance it is an impossible tussle between the assets and the financial side and the well-being and actually looking after the children and staff. It is impossible, and I think that the only way would be actually around firm guidance, that you have the ability to have some local context, but I'd be really surprised if big wide-scale decisions of that magnitude were having to be taken at local level.
Yeah, but I think and this feeds into Simon's point, is that the guidance that has been developed by government will be in many respects led by the various associations and leaders, and there needs to be I think what we're saying is there needs to be balance in terms of the composition of those groups, and that's not to undermine any one of those perspectives, but if you look at who's represented across the system, probably needs to be representatives from governance, representatives from pedagogy, representatives from business, and we get back to the leadership triangle that I've been talking about for the last 4 or 5 years.
And that does go back to Simon's point around it being a representative kind of basis for decisions. The challenge with that is the more representative it is, the longer it will take. and decisions having to be made. So it's a really tough one. So it's trying to get that balance right that is the key challenge for the authorities at the moment.
I would agree with Will.
Yeah.
I think the key has got to be some as clear as it can be guidance as to how schools, not when, and when is useful as well, and sometimes useful too, but how schools open up. I think some of the more useful guidance over the last few weeks has been in connection with staff, with social distancing, with the isolation. There has actually been some very, very clear steers, and I completely agree with what Simon said yesterday. We have been overwhelmed by guidance, but actually when you pick out the guidance you really need, and then you look at your own context, some of it in terms of the dealing with the staff who are self-isolating, or the staff who are on shielding, and those differences, actually it's been detailed, can be quite technical, but it's been useful. And I do, and I think back to in the 2 or 3 weeks before schools closed, we as a trust were hanging on like grim death to the guidance that was being produced to validate what we were doing. And we were watching it then. It seems to have gone back into the mist of time somewhat, but we were watching it then to work out what we were doing, because it was the only way to validate to our parents and our trustees and our own governance arrangements that we were following some guidance that was in a situation that was outside our own ken. And I think we've got the same thing again. So we do need clear guidance, and we need time to implement that. I think I've said in another conversation that, we could close schools down within 48 hours, and that was pretty much, or mostly close them down within 48 hours. That wasn't actually too difficult to achieve. And I think the pedagogical staff and the school business leaders working together have done a fantastic job in keeping education going. And I didn't realise until early on today that actually other countries have just simply shut schools, haven't guaranteed ongoing education, which is what I think the government's tried to do, and the schools have faithfully followed. But to start it back up again, we need time. We need several weeks. Simon's point about Legionella is simplest. Not every school in the world's closed. Some have kept their routines going, but those that have fully closed, there's going to be a huge demand. That comes back to the supply and demand curve again. Huge demand on those sorts of services. We need time, and then we need the guidance. And if we've got those two things, then we'll have a fighting chance to get things back into place, or put something back in for some of our students. And I think, from my point of view as well, something else that is only just beginning to be spoken about, but that's coming back in, is the well-being of our staff and students. There are going to be a significant number of students and staff who have lost people, or know somebody they've lost, who have struggled with missing so many members of their family and their friends, and had all their usual social structures disrupted, that adaptation is going to be difficult, and the year groups that you can think that are coming back in, year sixes, if we don't get them back in before September, will have had 5 months out of education, and that's huge. Our year 10s, which could end up being a lost generation if we're not careful, because they've lost so much of this year for their own courses. There's so many different challenges and so many different priorities, and that's why we need some steer and some guidance.
Yeah. You touched on a subject there that I'd like to close with, and that's one around mental health. And so I think there's the ripple effect, the aftermath of COVID means that, as a community, as a society, we would have suffered a trauma, and it would have touched us in different ways, some more deeply than others. But nevertheless, schools, I think, will be trying to pick up the pieces, both for staff, for parents, for pupils, and I suspect we'll need professionals to help us through it. So if we could just go very quickly round the virtual room, starting with Simon, just to touch on that, and I wondered if your schools have given any thought to that.
Yeah, we have support from the local authority for the on educational support services. so that I'm sure will be called upon. But we also have done a lot with the staff. So we've been looking at ways of giving them something every couple of weeks to help. We've been looking at various apps that are being offered. A lot of organisations at the moment are putting stuff out there. The World Health Organization have put out guidance on managing stress. So we've passed that out. We've passed stuff out to parents to help with pupils. In one of my schools, we have had a fatality for coronavirus, which we've had to deal with the staff. It is hard. I guess you just need to be pragmatic again and think, okay, we need to get through this. There's probably going to be a need, but we can't solve a problem that we can't quantify at this point. So be sympathetic, try and keep staff motivated. Some of my teams and departments are having daily meetings or using online meetings using various software. I try and keep in contact with all my line managers at least every couple of days using online, because whilst you can send an email, you can't see the people, you can't see what they're looking like, you can't get so much of the tone. Even with a phone call, that's limited. So I would encourage people, make use of the online technology as much as you can to keep in contact with your teams. Be sympathetic towards the parents and the pupils, but I don't think we can worry too much about it because it's an unknown quantity at this point. And we don't know what the government advice will be and what they may add to the party. I mean, we've just seen them put out laptops and ICT kit for disadvantaged pupils and those that are at risk. Who knows what they might come up with as far as well-being by the time we reach the point of schools reopening.
Yeah, thank you, Simon. And Will, just on that issue.
Yeah, I agree with Simon. It's kind of wait and see what advice and support will perhaps come available. But I think I've been blown away by the whole country. How everybody's, that spirit of pulling together is something that certainly hasn't felt like it's been there over the past years. But it's amazing in a month how the country feels to its change, and if you can kind of hold on to those community aspects and that overall feeling of we're all in this together, I think that helped. In terms of what we've been doing with our teams, we've had a number of our team really struggle on a childcare issue, and actually, like Simon says, we do a lot of video meetings, but we make sure we put in social events throughout the day, whether it's quizzes, whether it's everyone bring your kids in on the call, bring your pets in on the call, whatever it might be, just to break up, just to give an element of socializing, because as human beings, that humanity is what everybody's missing at the moment through the lack of contact. So we're doing what we can. It's by no means enough, but you can only do what you can do right now.
That's helpful. And I'll leave the last comment to Adrienne. We're sadly out of time, but just a few words from you.
Yeah, I would second what both Will and Simon have said. We have regular video meetings with all of our teams, every one of our trust, every one of our schools does in our trust. Try and keep touch with them. I agree, seeing them on the screen, you can pick up on some of the visual clues, see how they're going. In terms of when we get back, I think we do have got to meet that one when it comes. However, as a trust in Warrington, we had a number of students who were affected by the Manchester bombings across our schools, and actually, what we have one or two needs to call on serious medical professional help, but in the main, it was the strength of the pastoral systems in the school that helped get those students through. And I think if every school will need strong pastoral systems, because where I think everybody will have to play into it, and that I think will be one of the key things, as supported by whatever advice, guidance, help other professionals we can get when we go back. But I think that will be a key thing.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for participating in today's podcast. Some tremendous insights there, some really useful information, and I'm sure some tips that people will find incredibly helpful. So everybody stay safe. Thank you very much for participating, and see you all again soon.